Oh, well, hello there. Welcome back to Introduction to Cultural Anthropology. I'm going to speak briefly about Nanook of the North, a film that you watched, and kind of give you a little bit of context to understand why this film was used, why it's important to um, recognize it, see what sort of an impact it's had on not only the anthropological world but on the world itself. Okay, let's talk for a moment about it. So, Nanook of the North is essentially the first documentary film ever made. This is important to understand. It was filmed, or I should say, released in 1922, um, just over 100 years ago. It's significant in the fact that um, it is this first attempt to look at another culture and to kind of try and understand it, and to create a film uh, doing that, describing it, and seeing how it functions, um, and just allowing the people of the time the chance to see a culture they might have heard about, or maybe they didn't even know existed, um, and to see how these folks actually lived. So it has the distinction of being the first feature length documentary film. Um, in itself, we're looking at a community of Inuit, and how they live their sort of daily lives, um, how they gather resources, how they create their homes, um, and it gives us kind of an idea of what it's like to live in what is seemingly a very barren landscape. Although importantly to recognize, one, that they have adapted to exceptionally well. And I think that's important to understand. Um, Franz Boas did some work with uh, Inuit and northern peoples that live around the Arctic Circle. And one of the things that he realized is that, um, you know, technologically they might not be very advanced as their southern neighbors might have been, but that does not necessarily make them any less capable. He had realized that had he have just gone into that environment on his own with the knowledge that he had, he would have been dead within days. Okay, the specific knowledge needed to survive that is passed down from generation to generation um, ensures that that community survives and, in fact, thrives, right? And so it's important to understand that while technologically different they may be, does not necessarily make them any less than. So he was really sort of looking at um, sort of this idea that civilized cultures were in fact better than these other cultures. Thinking about ethnocentrism, right? The fact that our culture is better than other cultures. So in doing this film, um, Flattery wanted to show what it was like to live in this community and to see the successes and maybe the failures as well that they might experience. Excuse me. Okay, so a couple things about the film. Uh, we see that it is a pretty barren landscape. Most of the resources are either going to be caught, right? So we're talking fish or seal or walrus. If you're looking for food, Arctic fox, and anything that can be caught is going to be used as a fuel source. Not a lot of vegetables, not a lot of plants. Um, if you go further into the interior, then yes, you're going to find some Arctic forests and you'll find some plants there, but really not a lot to survive on. So they were primarily meat eaters. Um, and at the same time, if you look at their meat consumption, most of it is raw. Um, because there's not a lot of ways to make fire. Um, there's moss in a lot of those places, as you would have seen in the film. Otherwise, not a ton of resources to be able to use. So meat is first and foremost the resource that is used the most. And from gathering that meat, the hides get turned into clothing, bones get turned into tools. You'll see that some of the knives that Nanook and others use are actually knives made out of tusk, walrus tusk, which becomes quite suitable for the resources that they need. We see some ideas about gender. Um, Certainly, some of the roles that men and women both play, although um, it's not so segregated as we might think. Women would certainly help in the pursuit of hunting, but they're also very much set up for domestic household work. But when we think about those kinds of occupations, uh, we generally have a sense of very sort of like set ideas. And when you live in a community, when you live in an environment such as this, it's the case that everybody participates, everybody helps out in whatever way that they can, which includes hunting, fishing, and that kind of stuff. So um, it is genderized, but it's not always set in stone that you'll see that sort of behavior. Uh, Thinking about things like clothing, right? I don't know if you noticed the difference in gender clothing. You see that with women, you see sort of like a almost like the clothing has like a beaver tail. Um, so you can see the distinction. Men are usually wearing like polar bear pants or leggings to help seal in the heat. Um, so there's little things like that you can pick up on and see. If you can recognize that there are differences in clothing. Um, that sort of beaver tail type looking part of the women's wear acts great if you're having to spend longer times sitting. It creates like a sort of like a movable mat for you to sit on and use, especially if you're, living in the snow. What I want to talk about now, and then we'll end this video shortly thereafter, is sort of some of the controversy around this film. Granted, this was the first attempt at doing like a documentary film and having it released in the States as a feature film. So it's really important to recognize that. This film today would be what we would consider like a docudrama. So Flattery went in originally and shot a film, brought it back, and the film caught on fire. And all of his work was destroyed. So he had to go back and refilm this documentary. In the process, he thought about how he wanted to have the folks that were living there sort of displayed. And so there was a little bit of producing. So Nanook himself was not actually, that was not his actual name, but it sounded good, that Nanook of the North, Bear of the North, had a good ring to it, so that's what they called him. That's what Flattery decided to use as his name. He didn't actually have those wives. He didn't have two wives. Those women were added on as sort of like cast members, along with their children. So this is sort of a fictional family. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that While this was filmed as and displayed as an authentic film about these people's lives and how they would experience their lives, that does not negate necessarily that the experiences that they're having weren't very realistic. In fact, they were. This is very much how these folks would live and survive. It just so happened that there was a little production that goes in along with it. And that's why we would consider it more of a docudrama than a pure documentary. A couple other things. Flattery really wanted to show sort of like what it was like to live as an Inuit in those areas, sort of um, prior to or right at the like contact with Western culture. So you see spears and you see harpoons and you see ways of catching fish or bear or whatever, or walrus. Uh, and in reality, at that time, they all had rifles, right? Rifles had made their way into these communities, and it was prevalent that members in this community would have a rifle to use and made hunting and stuff that much easier. So you don't see any rifles in this film. Flattery again was trying to sort of showcase the local culture prior to sort of contact, with the exception of that, one of those first scenes where they're interacting with the white Canadian trader. Um, and even then, that had sort of big implications, right? Interestingly enough, if we think about globalism at the time, the fact that there's this trader, and you could see in the background that there is a whole wall of pelts, right, of white Arctic foxes, and there were polar bear pelts. Uh, and this is telling us sort of a story of the importance of these pelts and how they were sort of being introduced in sort of like uh, a global space. And what I mean by that is that prior to uh, connecting to the Western world and the desire for those pelts, right? Um, those animals were not hunted um, to the extent that they were prior to that contact, right? At contact, those pelts became a resource to sell and to give those community members, the Inuit, access to more resources. But it also had an impact on the environment. Folks that watched this movie saw those pelts, and it actually created more of a desire to uh, get a pelt just like those. So we actually saw like a bump in trading in fur after this film came out. Um, so we need to think about sort of like the global implications. People were also really interested in um, uh, this place, this um, this Arctic environment, and it drew people in. It actually created some ecotourism for people to go out there and experience it for themselves, and that has an impact, right? So this film has a little bit of controversy, but I think still does a pretty good job of explaining, some of the basic life experiences. Um, Also thinking about another experience in the film that was sort of created for viewing when they were building the igloo, right? And and if you notice, it's not particularly large. You don't want a really large igloo because they're difficult to build, and you don't need that much room um, for the family. Everyone gets nice and cozy, and you're there for a few days, a week until you move on, if you're moving on to somewhere else. The problem is that, um, and this is sort of a technical issue, igloos are dark. They're dark and difficult to film in, and there's not a lot of space. So when they show the interior video of the igloo, it's actually a half igloo that was built, kind of like a set, in which people were waking up and sort of getting ready for the day. But that was actually outside with a half igloo built to demonstrate what it would be like had they been inside of an igloo. The problem is space and light, and to get that camera set up. Yeah. So again, this film is important to recognize for what it is. It started off this push for documentaries, for seeing other people's and other people's lives, but there was also some production value to it, right? And we have to take that into account when we consider these kinds of films. Is there production to it? So, yeah. And then the last thing, sort of like the music. The music itself, this music was added to this film, I think in like 1999, 98, something like that. Prior to this film it was a silent film. And had it been shown in the theater, which it would have been in 1922, 1923, and so forth, it would have had an accompanying musician playing music for it. So that would have been like either a small band or a piano player, and they would have been either tasked with creating music, and I'm not sure if they actually sent music with the film. I don't think so, but they would play to it. And one of the things that you have to remember about music, and this is important for all film, is that music creates a sense of emotion. And so if you see emotion or hear it, then you're expected, this is how I should feel. This is leading me up to a certain expectation, right? When Nanook was first being presented with a gramophone, right, and was hearing boxed human voices for the first time. And the music in the background was really kind of jovial, kind of happy, and everyone's, it's do 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 do. Is really kind of like a funny, you know, um, musical experience. But that set the tone for Nanook's experience, right? That it created an emotional connection, even though we couldn't hear his voice or his laughter or anything like that. This film uses music to set the tone, okay? And it informs you as to how you should feel or expect, right? If there's suspense, right, then you'll have suspenseful music. Um, Keep that in mind whenever you're watching documentary films, because that is setting you up for a certain type of experience. Um, and this is one of those films where it becomes very prevalent that is sort of the intent of that music, right? Is to set the feeling, which is the case with, all music when it comes to soundtracks. So, yeah, those are my notes on Nanook of the North. Hopefully you watch the entire thing, and this is one of my favorite films when it comes to ethnographic films, not only because of its age, but because of the fact that it actually does a pretty good job of showing what it's like, with a few caveats here and there. And with all films, there's always a caveat. So we just have to recognize those and for what they are and go forward. Okay, that's it. We'll continue the film series and talk more about anthropological film. Okay, we'll see you soon.